The U.S. military is facing its greatest recruitment crisis in 50 years. Military leaders say they are struggling to hit their enlistment targets because most potential recruits simply do not meet the military's eligibility standards, while data shows that over half of young people simply do not see a future in the armed forces. Many attribute this to information about the military's internal culture being more readily available in this day and age, including reports of racism and sexual harassment, and fears of lack of adequate care and support for veterans. Others argue that the decline in recruitment has more to do with how young people view the military and a shift in personal beliefs when it comes to war. So what is behind this decline? And are we witnessing a change in Americans' relationship to the military? That's our conversation this week in an UpFront special. Joining us is Monisha Rios, a veteran of the U.S. Army and member of Truth in Recruitment, a nonprofit group educating young people on the consequences of a military career. Richard Brookshire is a U.S. Army veteran and co-founder of the Black Veterans Project. And Caitlin Considine is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran and founding member of Gamers for Peace, a group dedicated to speaking truth to war in digital spaces in order to counter military recruitment. I want to thank you all for joining me on UpFront. Caitlin, I'm going to start with you. 2022 was the worst year for military recruitment since the U.S. draft ended in 1973. With the Army in particular struggling to meet its goals, military officials have pointed to the fact that just 23% of young people ages 17 to 24 meet the military's health and fitness and academic standards. You counsel young people about recruitment. What would you say are the main factors that keep prospective recruits from joining?
I think they're correct in that a lot of the younger generation would not qualify for military service in the first place. Additionally, I do think that Gen Z, the generation after us, I do think that they are much more skeptical of military service. There is a study from the Military Family Advisory Network that saw an 11% decrease in service members who would recommend military service to their families as of, I believe, 2022. So there's a shift in the perception of military service, in addition to a lot of systemic problems like lack of education and lack of access to decent food and poverty that is making a lot of the population not very suitable for military service.
Monisha, there's a survey in 2019 by the Center for American Progress, and this study found that a majority of Gen Z respondents ages 17 to 24 agreed that, quote, the wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan were a waste of time, lives, and taxpayer money, and they did nothing to make us safer at home. That's a quote. Do you see an ideological shift in how young people are perceiving the U.S. military? And if so, what are the ways that it's changed?
Absolutely. And I think if we start with how the U.S. was created to begin with, we know that the U.S. was born out of exploitation, slavery, the theft of land, and the U.S. military was born out of that same character. And so our generations now have had way more access to information and have been challenged in ways that have grown them, unlike previous generations where those generations were taught not to question the U.S. government and not to question why we're going to war, but that it's your duty to go. And if you're a good citizen, then you'll go. But now our youth are not being fooled by these narratives. And climate change, I think, has a lot to do with that. You have access to information on the front lines of resistance toward violence against the land. Like you have Standing Rock, you have missing and murdered Indigenous women, you have the hypocrisies and contradictions of the U.S. right in our faces. And we're able to talk about it now in ways that we weren't able to talk about it before, especially after the Trump era. And so with the U.S. being the largest polluter in the world, the largest holder of real estate in the world with more than 4,800 defense sites everywhere on all continents in more than 160 countries, I think Gen Z is really connected with what the impacts of that are. And as you said in that quote, I mean, absolutely, it was a complete waste of life for all parties concerned to go to war, and for what?
Today, with the internet, young people have all kinds of access. to the realities of war, the violence, the bodies, the harm that soldiers suffer, and also the harm that soldiers cause. Do you think that those things are not only changing people's perception of war, which I think is we could agree on, but is it making people less likely to want to enlist? Caitlin, would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think that with the rise of the digital age and greater access to all of this information, we have a box that literally contains almost all of the information in the world in our pockets most of the time. And Gen Z grew up with that. I really do think that having that access and having at ready, you can just Google US military war crime and have a list right in front of you within seconds. So I do think that that is having a very real effect on people's desire to enlist. This is definitely being viewed as more of a rigid decision or a rigid decision-making process rather than, oh, well, my dad did this, so I can do this type of deal.
I want to insert that what's often missing from this conversation is that military service is intergenerational. There are usually three things that indicate very well whether someone will join the military. It's whether they come from a military family, they grow up near a military base, and then socioeconomic status, right? And I think what's happening is that you have generations of veterans that have gone through unjust wars. You also have generations of veterans who've been fighting to get access because they have to live in deplorable conditions outside of just war, right? You have bases that are rife with mold. When I was a combat medic, I worked in an aid station on a base in Germany that had been condemned by the German government, and that was our medical center. So I think that like the extent to which these problems exacerbate themselves when you get out and you can't get access to basic health care or disability compensation. And it is affecting the generations that are growing up watching their fathers or their grandfathers, their grandmothers, their aunts, their sisters not struggle with access. We just had our country pass the biggest veterans bill in history to try to address that issue, because that is the real issue, is that people have been locked out and sometimes, depending on the color of skin, generationally from benefits, right? And so the appeal that the military has, the lie that they can sometimes propagate, that you'll be better off if you serve, like the veneer of that is so diluted now. And marry that with the information that you can so readily find online, it's no surprise that young people can kind of see right through.
It is well documented that military recruiters target young people from low-income neighborhoods. Over 80% of people who enlist come from households with lower incomes. Recruits are offered attractive signing bonuses, offers to pay for education, and recruitment materials emphasize the career opportunities of joining the military. Keeping in mind that U.S. poverty is steadily growing in terms of the poverty rate over the last few years, has this actually become a full-fledged poverty draft?
Yeah, I believe so. And listen, that does not negate that if you are able to go into the military, have a full career, actually gain access to your benefits, that you can't be better off. But so many folks, specifically marginalized people from marginalized communities, are the ones left holding the bag, falling through the cracks, struggling to attain access. And my work kind of focuses explicitly on the Black community and the effects there.
Well, I mean, that's a great point, because Black folk are overrepresented in the military. We make up over 17% of active duty members. For context, we make up 12.5% to 13% of the U.S. population, depending on the year. So, there's a 2019 survey of active duty service members that found that more than half of minority service members say they have personally witnessed examples of white nationalism, of ideological-driven racism within the ranks, one or the other. Given the high number of reports of racism, why are we still joining so heavy?
Because there's a illusion of lack of opportunity. No, not just an illusion. There is actually a lack of opportunity in a lot of these neighborhoods that Black youth are being pulled from, and that's been the case for decades now. And then guess what? You get out of the military, even if you serve 20 years, you're likely returning to those resource-poor neighborhoods where your family reside, right? So, yeah.
No, that absolutely helps. Monisha, I want to pivot for a minute. The Department of Defense estimates that in 2021, close to 36,000 active duty service members experienced unwanted sexual contact. More than half of them women. A third who reported, I want to stress that, were discharged within 1 year. The military has claimed that they're making significant reforms. They want to address the culture that enables sexual violence in the military. But those same 2021 Department of Defense statistics show some of the highest estimates for unwanted sexual contact since they started keeping records back in 2004. I guess my question is simply, what is the military doing to really prevent sexual violence?
They're not really trying to prevent it. Rape is a weapon of war. It's sanctioned. It's accepted.
Say more about that. Explain what you mean when you say that.
So I've said it a lot, and I always get an angry response. But it's true. If we actually take the time to listen to the populations that we are invading with our wars of conquest and wars of choice, and when we actually take a look at their data that they're presenting about the sex crimes that occur from military personnel onto their communities, onto their children, onto their young women, then you can actually see the whole picture. And when you look at historically the lack of adjudication that's occurred inside the military with military sexual violence because of the good character defense, because of all the reasons why maintaining good order and discipline, all the excuses that leadership maintains in order to perpetuate the use and acceptance of this weapon of war, then it makes sense to anyone, well, to me, that we share perpetrators. How am I going to believe, as a person who went through this myself, who witnessed it constantly at every duty station that I was at? I was wearing the team's uniform and it happened to me. So of course it's going to happen where people are stationed, where we're occupying, where we're taught to dehumanize those people.
So if order and discipline and structure and rules are part of what makes the military, then why is it so hard to get justice when you say something about it? Why? It seems the only people getting discharged, that's why I stuck with this number, a third of those who reported were discharged. Not a third of people accused. A third of the people who said, I got assaulted, I got touched, I got harm done to me, a third of those people are gone within 12 months. How?
Because it keeps you quiet. Because it removes you. You become the problem if you're the one who speaks up, if you report. That's why there's retaliation. And there's a lot of talking about preventing it, about stopping it, about supporting people if they report. But that doesn't actually happen.
Caitlin, I see you nodding.
I agree with Monisha. I mean, one thing that she's saying, where it's not just within the ranks, it is also where service members are stationed. It doesn't just have to be an active war. We have bases in over 80 countries, and pick any one of them. You can definitely see that effects. I also experienced this while I was active duty in the Marine Corps, wearing the same uniform. And one thing that I noticed, all of these briefs about prevention, all of these briefs about what to do if it happens and how to report it, it is framed as how not to get in trouble. It's, oh, be careful if you have a beer and this other person also has a beer. You need to be careful. It's not based on in respect. It's always, I remember this one very weird turning point for me. It was during a brief, and it was I believe a gunnery sergeant was giving the SAPR brief, which is a sexual assault prevention and response program. And he asks, why is this such a bad thing? And the first person to raise their hand said, because it affects unit cohesion. And now I'm not saying that that person is wrong, but that wouldn't be my first answer.
That wouldn't be my
first
go-to answer, yeah.
Exactly. It's a bad thing to do, should be the first answer.
Right.
And because it takes away bodily autonomy, it abuses your power, all of these different things. But it was always framed in how not to get in trouble and how it affects your unit, as opposed to basic respect for human bodily autonomy.
Right.
That's why it doesn't go away when you report. That's why the person who reported it goes away. That's why I experienced mild, definitely not to the level of some people, but mild retaliation, because I was the problem by making waves. I rocked the boat. And so they want that to go away because it means they don't have to deal with the core of it.
Richard, so much of this is happening to women. And so I'm curious to know, as a man who served in the military, what do you see? Do you see that discourse that they're talking about, the how not to get caught? Do you see the harm? Do you see Did you witness this stuff?
And it doesn't just affect women. I mean, I think the statistics around sexual assault, around male sexual assault in the military are horrendous as well. And the unit cohesion argument, I'm glad that you brought that up because, I served under Don't Ask, Don't Tell as a gay soldier. So I understand the harms and the excuse that they can make about inclusion or the dangers of inclusion because how it might affect unit cohesion. But it's also the same argument that they used against black people 75 years ago. This year is the 75th anniversary of the desegregation of the military. And they talked about how in World War II, when they were doing surveys, when they were preparing for after World War II up into 1948 to desegregate, the vast majority of people in the military were against it because they felt it would disrupt unit cohesion, right? So I think that's a common response.
It's a disturbing response. Caitlin, I've been seeing a lot of recruitment efforts in digital entertainment spaces now. There's a big boom in it, frankly, especially video games. The military has had a hand in the creation of some of these video games for decades, but now all 6 branches of the U.S. military have electronic sports teams for competitive video gaming and partnerships with popular video game players on platforms like YouTube and Twitch. You work with Gamers for Peace. That's why I'm going to you on this. A group that, of course, is dedicated, as you say, to speaking truth to war in digital spaces in order to counter military recruitment. Can you explain how digital recruitment with video games works and what we should do about it?
So sure. Well, you already have first-person shooter games like COD, first-person shooter games like America's Army. That's literally sanctioned by the U.S. Army. It's now been decommissioned, but it was a long-running free-to-play game. And all of these other games that have military themes, I'm not telling you not to play these games. This is not the point of this. But they do serve a propaganda purpose, just like military movies do. It is similar, only in video games, you as the player have a hand in how all of that goes. And a lot of them have pretty simplistic storylines, right? Where the protagonist is trying his best to defeat the enemy, whatever the particular enemy for that game storyline is, and is generally in a good versus evil sort of paradigm. And so when you couple that with these esports games that are run by, they're not recruiters, but they are recruiters because they're serving a recruiting purpose, no matter what they say. Even the Navy, in order to get that job, they have to go through the same recruiting training that a Navy recruiter would have to go through. So you couple that together, there you have people being able to form a parasocial relationship that you would with any other Twitch streamer while they're playing these very oversimplified, gamified versions of war. And so you have this effect of simultaneously trivializing war and military service while also talking to someone who is actively in that military service, talking it up and getting people to either support it or look upon it positively like a recruiter would. And so you have this on Twitch with a very young audience. It skews very, very young. And it's kind of a gold mine for recruiters because it skews very young, it skews very male too. And so you kind of have this double-edged sword of like the perfect storm of recruiting for this. There's very few regulations involved. There's not a lot of safeguards.
Would you call for regulation of this? Would you call for them to be completely banned? What would you call for in response?
I mean, my ideal would be completely banned, but right now the regulations are coming from Twitch. They're not coming from the government. Like, for example, the U.S. Army got told by Twitch that they had to cease this immediately because they used a fake Xbox controller giveaway that when you clicked on it was actually a recruiting website used to data mine information from the people clicking on it. Right. And this was not the government saying you can't do this. This was Twitch saying, hey, this goes against our guidelines. Please don't do this.
When a corporation steps up, when a corporation steps up and say, this is too far for us, right? That's what I get really nervous. Research suggests that players of violent video games view their opponents as less human. This is concerning to me because when we consider that military video game plots are often constructed in ways that mirror real-life conflicts around the globe. A 2016 study looking at a first-person shooter video game found that some of the most common enemies, multiple games, in fact, they studied, that some of the most common enemies were Russian ultranationalists, then Latin American and Middle Eastern terrorists. When the military is invested in these types of games, does it run the risk of making potential soldiers view other people, the other, as less human? I know this is your wheelhouse, Caitlin, but I also see Monisha nodding too, so I got to ask you, what do you say?
Yes, and I really want to encourage people to critically examine the role of the American Psychological Association in all of this, particularly the Division of Military Psychology. Because when we go back to the beginning of military recruitment, even during the draft, during World War II, and after the draft, when we moved into the poverty draft, when they had to get creative on how to build their force and create a more lethal force when they couldn't legally mandate you to be in their force, it goes all the way back to there. And going through military training, the objective is for you to dehumanize the manufactured enemy on command. It's to build your own capacity to dehumanize another person, regardless of whether or not you know them, because of a story that's told to you. So that's exactly what Hollywood does. That's exactly what video games do, especially with the move toward cyber warfare, drone warfare, and all of these, as the military technology advances, so too must the training technology. And how convenient for the military, for the U.S. government's use of the military, to have that training already integrated into its recruitment propaganda.
Wow.
Which video games are perfect for that.
They're absolutely perfect for that. Richard, according to the recently launched Veterans Justice Commission, many veterans struggle with mental health challenges, substance abuse, homelessness, criminality, all these things after leaving the military. Roughly 1/3 of veterans report having been arrested or booked into jail after leaving the military at least once in their lives. We often hear about the highly complex process veterans are forced to navigate in order to access adequate care for injuries, for illnesses, and especially for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. How much does knowing what we know now about PTSD and other emotional and psychological issues suffered by veterans and the struggle to access adequate care for them, how much does that play into people not wanting to enlist? Like, are people like, you know what, this is going to end for me badly?
Yeah, I guess let me paint a human story with this. So I'm glad you brought up PTSD. So we, Black Veterans Project, partner with Yale Law School to do a study of the last 20 years of disability compensation by VA, and we're able to show statistically significant disparities, specifically around PTSD, a 29% disparity in denial rates that Black vets face, right? So when you think about the disparities when it comes to poverty that Black vets face, are twice as likely. They represent a full third of the homeless veteran population in the country, and the list can go on and on. But Conley Monk essentially is taking that data. He filed a suit as a Vietnam vet who filed a suit through Yale in federal court in this past November. And so Conley's story, I think, is emblematic because he joined up as a volunteer in the late 60s, went to Vietnam, did 2 tours as a Marine there, got into an altercation when someone called him a racial epithet, and next thing you know, he was on the other side of a dishonorable discharge. Wow. It took him 40 years of fighting to get access to VA healthcare, disability compensation. He wasn't able to use his GI Bill to buy a home for 4 decades. He wasn't able to gain access to education benefits. And he is suing for back pay for what the VA should have been giving him the whole time. But he's also suing on behalf of his deceased father, who was a World War II veteran, in return and didn't get access to the GI Bill. And I think Conley's story is
important. Was common.
This is common. This is common and intergenerational. Goes back to the conversation about intergenerational, the intergenerational impact on families. Both of Conley's sons did not join the military, right? They became law enforcement officers, right? But they didn't join up, and they're around my age. So I think, and I highly doubt that the generations that precede them will probably have a very direct conversation about the real consequences of joining, but also the struggles that the family has had intergenerationally of going off, serving in America's wars, having to face all untold levels of discrimination, and then to come back and not even have equitable access to the benefits that the government has promised.
Right. The whole reason you joined in the first place.
Right. And for the Black community, you're talking about compounded in these statistics, tens of billions of dollars siphoned out of the Black community because the government hadn't made good on its promise to Black veterans who served.
Absolutely. Monisha, Caitlin, Richard, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront. Everyone, that is our show. UpFront, we'll be back next week.